All right, let's go ahead and get started because we have limited time today. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on the US, China, and nuclear deterrence in the hypersonic era. I'm John Van Oudenarn, Editor-in-Chief of China Brief and China Program Manager at the Jamestown Foundation. It's probably an understatement to note that today's webinar topic has been in the headlines of late. This summer, China undertook at least 2 successful hypersonic weapons tests that have caused some to worry that it has gained an edge in the development of hypersonic delivery systems that would be very difficult, if not impossible, for US ballistic missiles systems, defense systems to intercept. Early last month, the Pentagon released its annual China military power report, which observed that China may already have a nascent nuclear triad and could have at least 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2027. But finally, following the Xi-Biden virtual summit last month, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan stated that President Biden and President Xi Jinping discussed the possibility of US-China strategic stability talks, but did not provide any further details. We've got 2 top-notch experts here with us today to talk us through these complex issues. First is Gill, who's Professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies at Macquarie University and a Senior Associate Fellow with the Royal United Service Institute in London. He's also inaugural scholar in residence for 2021, 2020, 2021 with the Asia Society Australia and brings a wealth of experience on Asian security issues. Second, we have David Logan, who's a Ph.D. candidate in security studies at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs and a Stanton Nuclear Fellow at the MIT Security Studies Program. So we'll just go quick overview of today's program. We're going to first turn to David, who's going to talk us through the change in continuity in China's approach to nuclear weapons, its development of capabilities and doctrine. And then we'll go to Dr. Gill, who's going to examine the impact of China's nuclear modernization and hypersonic development on strategic stability and deterrence dynamics. After that, we'll have a brief discussion on the prospects for strategic stability negotiations and arms control. And then finally, we'll turn to our audience for questions, which you can input into the chat box on the right side of the screen, or raise your hand to ask, your virtual hand, to ask a live question. Okay, with that, let's turn to David, who's going to kick us off. Thanks, David.
Great, thanks, John. Thanks for having us today. These are important and quickly developing topics, and glad that China Brief is hosting an event on this. I've always turned to China Brief for as a great resource, and glad to be on the panel with Bates. I've learned a lot from his work over the years. So I'll be talking a little bit about continuity and change within China's nuclear forces, some of the drivers that we might see motivating changes in those forces, and then what are some of the limitations to China's nuclear modernization. So first, looking at China's nuclear forces, I wanted to look at continuity and change in 3 buckets. Number 1 is doctrine. Number 2 are forces, what is the actual hardware? And then 3, sort of the operational posture, what does China actually do with its nuclear forces? So the first bucket of doctrine, this is the area that I think, at least publicly and officially, we've seen the least amount of change and the most continuity in. So for the last roughly 6 decades, China has proclaimed a strategy that is usually characterized as assured retaliation, viewing nuclear weapons as serving 2 purposes. 1, to prevent nuclear blackmail from other nuclear armed states, and 2, in the event that deterrence fails, to launch China's own nuclear retaliatory strikes. As extensions of this so-called assured retaliation strategy, China has proclaimed officially an unconditional no first use policy, promising to not use nuclear weapons first against any state at any time. There are questions about that, which we'll turn to. As an extension of the no first use policy, there were also commitments to not engage in arms racing and negative security assurances to not use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear armed states. And again, officially and publicly, we've seen strong continuity in China's stated views about nuclear weapons, the purposes that they serve, and the circumstances under which they would be used. There are, however, some questions about the contours or the limits of the no first use policy. Some of this emerges from some of the track 1.5 dialogues that have been held between US and Chinese experts, and growing concerns about whether China might use nuclear weapons first if it viewed its deterrent at risk from American conventional operations. And happy to talk more in the Q&A about what some of the questions are about the no first use policy. So the second big bucket is the actual forces themselves. What is the hardware that China deploys, and what are some of the new capabilities that are under development? So historically, China has had a relatively small and immature nuclear force. For several decades since its first test in 1964, it had a nuclear arsenal that was several times smaller than that of the United States and the Soviet Union, and today Russia, and even smaller than that of France and the United Kingdom. The force consisted largely of liquid fueled, these hulking ICBMs in rollout to launch facilities, very small numbers. But in the last couple of decades, and especially in the last several years, the size and composition of the force has experienced significant changes. So as John alluded to, the DoD, most recent DoD report assesses that China possibly already has a nascent nuclear triad consisting not only of the land-based nuclear missiles, but also a fleet of SSBNs for the naval leg, and a nuclear-capable bomber, reassigning nuclear missions to the PLA Air Force. For the land-based missiles, we've seen greater investment in mobility and survivability with the development of solid-fueled mobile missiles, including those that possibly have off-road capability and could launch without pre-prepared launch sites, which would significantly enhance their survivability. China, sometime around 2015, also was believed to operationally deploy MIRV, or multiple independently targetable reentry vehicle technology, to some of its ICBMs. And we've also seen a significant growth in the size of the rocket force, the military organization that is charged with China's land-based ballistic missiles. So past growth can be seen, I think, most starkly in the number of brigades that have been assigned to the rocket force. The brigades sort of represent the core launch element of the rocket force. And between 2017 and 2020, the number of brigades assigned to the rocket force grew from 29 to, I believe, 40 or 41 today. So a growth of 35%, at least in terms of number of brigades, in just a couple of years, dramatically outpacing growth that we had seen throughout the missile force's previous history. Now, some of those new brigades are conventionally armed, some of them are dual capable, but some of them are certainly nuclear capable as well. In addition to some of the past growth in the force, we also have new and fairly significant estimates about future growth. So the most recent DoD report estimated that by 2026, China would have deployed 200 warheads on ICBMs capable of striking the continental United States. By 2027, China would deploy 700 total deliverable nuclear warheads. And then by 2030, as John alluded to in the intro, 1,000 total nuclear warheads. There, I think, are reasons to be cautious about some of these estimates. We've been pretty bad about estimating future growth in China's nuclear warhead stockpile in the past. And there are some limitations about that growth that I'll talk about in just a second. But there's no doubt that the force will continue to grow. I think part of the question is, how much is that growth going to reach? Part of the reason that we know this is likely to grow is, as has been widely reported, the discovery of roughly 300 new silos at 3 different locations throughout China. There are a lot of outstanding questions about how those silos would be used, what they might be armed with, the purposes to which they would be assigned, but there's certainly a dramatic step in the increase in at least the potential silo-based force for China. And then finally, on the force side, we do see significant investments in hypersonic capabilities. China's investing in both hypersonic glide vehicles and scramjet technology, although most of the public information suggests greater investment on the hypersonic glide vehicle side. But in short, we're seeing China move towards a larger, more diverse, and more capable nuclear force structure. So finally, that third bucket, posture, what are they actually doing with these forces? And I would say that here we see some moderate hints of change, although I think there's still outstanding questions about how these forces are being operated. So historically, China has exercised strong centralized control over its nuclear forces. Only the most senior leaders on the Central Military Commission and the Politburo were in charge with alerting and using the nuclear forces controlled by the PLA. And this strong centralized control was also reflected in operational patterns. China was long believed to not mate nuclear warheads to its delivery vehicles and to store its delivery vehicles separate from launchers. We also saw this in authoritative texts, which would describe the nuclear retaliation strike as the only nuclear operation envisioned by PLA strategists. But in the last couple of years, there have been hints of change. So since 2017, there have been reports from PLA military reporting of exercises, possibly involving the first use of nuclear weapons prior to Chinese territory actually being struck with a nuclear warhead itself. The most recent DoD report describes high alert duty being executed by both conventional and nuclear brigades. And I think some of the details about what this actually means are still unknown, at least in the open sources, but indicating greater attention to higher alert status by the nuclear forces. And there's also hints of China developing the infrastructure that would be necessary to move to a launch on warning posture, and questions about how that may or may not be reconciled with the no first use policy that it proclaims to adhere to. So now that we have a sense of continuity and change on doctrine, forces, and posture, the question is, what are the drivers of some of this? And to be upfront, I don't have a very good and crisp answer to what are some of the drivers. I think increasingly there are many potential drivers, and I just wanted to highlight several right now. Happy to talk more in detail about how we could maybe adjudicate between some of these during the Q&A. So the first is I do think that concerns about survivability are driving much of what we're seeing today, even if it may not be the only potential explanation. So we know from Chinese writings and dialogues with Chinese experts that there's longstanding concerns about the survivability of China's nuclear deterrent. These concerns exist because of fears about advanced ballistic missile defense capabilities in the US, precision conventional strike options, advancing intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance assets, all of which Chinese strategists fear could give the United States the opportunity to execute a disarming first strike against China's nuclear forces, whether with conventional weapons or nuclear ones. Add to this the significant deterioration in the relationship between Washington and Beijing, and there's a sense that growing the force, making it more responsive, and diversifying it among more platforms can add to the survivability of the force and strengthen China's nuclear deterrent. A second possible driver, though, is what you might call bureaucratic politics. We've seen some hints that the domestic actors that are responsible for shaping China's nuclear forces and nuclear strategy may have shifted in the degree of influence that they enjoy. There's perhaps some evidence, and there's some speculation involved in this that maybe the military.
Oh, you don't have to mail it. You're creating a folder.
Has enjoyed greater influence over the direction of nuclear forces than maybe some of the labs have in the past, and that the military is pushing for a more capable and assertive posture. The third is the possible pursuit of status and prestige. China has set the goal of developing a world-class or first-tier military, and part of this might involve developing world-class or first-tier nuclear capabilities. Fourth is possible concerns about escalation control. From about 2018, we've seen some hints of Chinese strategists being worried that in a crisis or conflict between China and the United States, it would be the United States that would launch a nuclear weapon first, potentially using a tactical nuclear strike against a Chinese invasion fleet headed toward Taiwan or other Chinese military assets in the region. And developing theater nuclear options might be viewed by Chinese strategists as a way to try to deter first use by the United States. And then finally, there's the thought that perhaps Xi Jinping simply thinks differently about nuclear weapons and doesn't hold beliefs about their limited political utility that some of his predecessors did. So very quickly, I'll turn to some of the limitations that might inhibit or at least slow China's nuclear modernization. One is warhead designs. We do have evidence that China developed a neutron bomb in the 1980s and possibly experimented with low yield warhead designs in the 90s. Happy to talk more detail about that. But the best evidence that we have is that the deployed warheads are very large in terms of yield and weight. And so that could impose some limitations on the kinds of military operations that you might be able to execute with them. The second is China's relatively limited fissile material stockpile. China is believed to have stopped production of fissile material in the 1980s, and it does have some military plutonium stockpiled, but the size of those stockpiles do impose a meaningful limit on how much China could expand its nuclear warhead stockpile. Third are political and operational constraints. The long-standing desire to have strong centralized control of the nuclear forces appears to continue, and that presents real obstacles, for example, to the sea-based leg of the nuclear triad, and also to moving to a higher alert status. When you haven't developed the kind of command and control or early warning infrastructure necessary, or even some of the operational plans necessary to execute more flexible nuclear use options, that will impose certain constraints on the PLA going forward. So in conclusion, we do see significant changes in China's nuclear forces and potentially approach to nuclear weapons, but there are also strong areas of continuity. And I would say that in conclusion, there mostly are significant questions. We've seen a lot of headlines, I think, over the last year about new silos, hypersonic capabilities, but there are many details, I think, that remain to be known before we can draw firm conclusions. But I'm looking forward to talking more about this in the Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to John. Thanks.
Thanks, David. That's a great overview, and I think that tees us up well for Bates. We know that China's military development is not only involved developing its capabilities, but also reorganizing. So he's going to talk us through how command and control of these strategic assets might work and how China's evolving capabilities affect strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific. Thanks, Bates.
Great. Well, John, let me thank you very much, as well as the China Brief and the Jamestown Foundation for the opportunity to be here today. Especially honored to be on the panel with David. David's cutting edge work is leading the field, defining our understanding of China's nuclear weapons capabilities and posture. So as we've just heard, a real star in this area, and he's covered a lot of interesting topics already, and I'll just try to add a little bit more to it. what David is describing, these developments of continuity and change in relation to China's nuclear weapons, I see as part of an even larger and continuing PRC effort to develop and deploy what some PRC strategists, and a term I've also come to coin as well, use, and that is the development of an integrated strategic deterrent. And I recognize that this is a term that, Secretary Austin has been using a lot over the past year. It's a term that the Chinese have been using for 20 years. And I think we're finally reaching a point in the development of China's overall deterrent posture where capabilities are beginning to catch up to aspiration. And what we're talking about is a capability that deploys and coordinates a much more diverse and advanced set of both nuclear and conventional military capabilities. And I think we want to talk a little bit more about what the relationship is between these two, and in particular, how they affect command and control questions and questions of strategic stability. Very important in all of this is the greater integration, development and integration of capabilities in relation to space, as well as to cyber domains. And I think what the conclusion I'm reaching is that this integrated deterrence approach appears to me to place an increased importance on conventional deterrence and warfighting, and we'll talk later how the nuclear arm is connected. But that's mainly due to the growing sophistication and precision and what the Chinese would call informationization of PRC conventional strike capabilities, and that these are increasingly seen below the nuclear threshold as being more flexible, more adaptable, more usable, and even more capable in providing the kinds of deterrence and warfighting capabilities that the Chinese see coming at them over the horizon, particularly vis-a-vis the United States. So these developments raise all kinds of interesting, and new challenges, both for China, as David has laid out, and of course also for its potential adversaries. And I thought we could summarize those into sort of two broad categories. One, command and control, and second, how this all affects deterrence dynamics, especially between China on the one hand and the United States and its allies on the other. And these, very quickly begin to have serious ramifications for U.S. strategic, extended, and conventional deterrence postures, as well as matters of U.S.-China strategic stability. So first on command and control, as David's already alluded, simply the rapidly increasing size, complexity, and diversity of Chinese nuclear and conventional capabilities is putting, I would imagine, quite enormous new pressures on the command and control system. In addition to the increasing diversity of its traditional land-based ballistic cruise and hypersonic missiles, as David has said, introducing increasingly capabilities, both at nuclear capabilities, but also sort of strategic conventional capabilities in the air and at sea, especially the at-sea systems, as David said, really increasing the command and control challenge. And something we haven't alluded to yet, but which I think also is a part of the command and control challenge, is that let's not forget that the PLA is still in the midst of a massive reorganization and reform process, which does have direct implications, not only for the sort of strategic nuclear capabilities we're talking about here, but the command and control issues more broadly across strategic and conventional capabilities. So, the reorganization of the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, the introduction of an entirely new service arm, the PLA Strategic Support Force, and its role, the Strategic Support Force's role in both providing strategic capabilities that have implications for nuclear posture and use, but having its own operational mandate to also have a role in delivering both offensive and defensive strategic capabilities, especially in the cyber and space realm. So it's a complicated picture for the PLA and the command and control questions, which we can get into more deeply later. But this in turn has implications for these questions of deterrence and strategic stability. Now, on the one hand, we could argue that all of these developments and changes in China's approach to its nuclear posture in particular actually introduces a greater degree of strategic stability to the US-China relationship. You could make that argument. As Beijing is apparently increasingly confident of its ability to deliver assured nuclear retaliation. At the same time, though, of course, it also boosts Beijing's ability to deter the United States across a wider spectrum of the escalation ladder, conventional and nuclear, which may limit American freedom of maneuver in a crisis. So it poses new challenges to the United States, even as it may introduce greater stability at the strategic level between the two countries. This integrated strategic deterrence posture, which we're talking about, which has greater coordination across conventional, nuclear, space, and cyber domains, is surely going to complicate US military planning and operations. In my view, this growing sort of confidence on the part of the PLA at the nuclear level may mean then that the Chinese leadership becomes more confident about escalation control beneath the nuclear threshold, more confident in its ability to wield or use conventional capabilities, which will have strategic effect by limiting and possibly even defeating American and allied operations, especially close in to the Chinese mainland. So what we have emerging then, I think, because of the developments of its nuclear capabilities, plus increased conventional capabilities, we have the emergence, I think, of what some strategic analysts call the stability-instability paradox. Stability at the nuclear level, however, potential for increased instability as China gains confidence in both its deterrent and warfighting posture beneath the nuclear level in the conventional realm. Just a couple of other added challenges that we should discuss to strategic stability. We didn't touch on this much. David didn't touch on this much, but it's worth discussing. And that is the sort of potential for entanglement as China deploys intermediate missile systems and even longer range hypersonic systems, which are apparently dual capable. We're aware that the DF-21 and the DF-26 are indeed intended to be both conventional and nuclear systems. Less clear is whether the hypersonic systems, while presumably dual capable, will be deployed in that role as part of China's posture. Chinese sources claim that the hypersonic systems are not intended to be nuclear systems, but US military officials have stated otherwise. But these dual capable systems, sometimes co-located, and the ambiguity around them adds an added degree of potential for misunderstanding and raises the risk of instability at the strategic level. David also talked about other ambiguities, which I think are important to think about, including whether or not China's moving towards something, a broader reinterpretation of its no first use pledge, towards something more equating launch on warning or a higher alert status. We had the question of how the at-sea nuclear leg of the Chinese deterrent is going to be operated. What are the command and control systems in place to try and oversee and assure that that they're always capable of launching when asked to, but never capable of being launched by mistake. In other words, we're entering a far more complex and challenging period in the strategic relationship between the United States and China, and these ambiguities can certainly lead to misperceptions and escalatory actions. In the remaining couple of minutes that I've got, I thought I would just say a few words about hypersonics in particular, and what we can learn so far about what Chinese analysts in Chinese language writings are saying. I think it's difficult for us to assess just how authoritative some of these writings are, but nevertheless, it's interesting to see that the Chinese strategic analytical community is writing about hypersonics, and also interesting to see that these analysts likewise acknowledge and grapple with both the opportunities and challenges that these systems present. Reading Chinese analytical works on hypersonics, we learn that they seem to believe that these systems provide considerable deterrence potential for China, owing in part to their dual capability. But they're also seen as value, not as a nuclear deterrent, but they're seen quite valuable as well at the conventional level, being highly suitable for preemptive strikes, and of course, providing psychological deterrent effects against a given enemy. They talk about macro and micro level deterrence effects. At the macro level, being able to provide a shift in the strategic balance of forces against an adversary like the United States, which will then undermine undermine the strategic intent or strategic resolve of adversaries. And of course, at a micro level, because they can defeat ballistic missile defenses, this then in turn can affect the force disposition, the force deployment and distribution, et cetera, of enemy forces. Finally, there are a number of other things we can say about hypersonics from the Chinese point of view, but I see we're running a bit out of time. But I'm interested to note that there is some consternation expressed by Chinese analysts about the effects of hypersonics on strategic stability and the concern that they may drive arms racing between China and potential adversaries. So while on the one hand, I think the US tendency, I think, is to interpret the development of Chinese hypersonics as having a sort of successful impact on American strategic thinking, successful in the sense that it's deterring us. It's also clear that there is some debate within the Chinese analytical community just as to the wisdom of going too far, too fast in the development and deployment of hypersonic weapons, precisely because it can lead to arms racing or other destabilizing aspects of the relationship with the United States. Lots more to talk about, but I think I'll conclude there, John, and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Bates. I think that really sets us up to move into the second part of the conversation about strategic stability and arms control. So we heard from David how China has built up its missile forces and its previously pretty small and recessed nuclear force into a sizable, but still far behind the U.S. and Russia force outside the constraints of nuclear arms control or any arms control. We also, though, have heard from Bates that there are some concerns, and I've seen this myself in Beijing about arms racing dynamics. So I'd like to ask you both to kind of look into your respective crystal balls and think about what factors might drive China to enter serious arms control negotiations with the United States.
Why don't you go ahead, David?
Starting off with an easy one. I will say, I think that we heard a lot of talk about so-called trilateral arms control between the United States, Russia, and China. And I think that a lot of the ways that some of those arms control agreements were envisioned are quantitative limits on deployments. And I think that anything that's involving that is not only impossible in the short term and unlikely even in the medium to long term. I think it's less necessary. I think, and as Bates alluded to, I think some of the more pressing issues when it comes to the US-China relationship in the nuclear domain have to do with issues that increase the likelihood of nuclear use, increase misperception, increase the possibilities of escalation. And those include things like entangled forces. What are the definitions of nuclear use? And I know your question was how do we get there, but I think I'm focusing first on just what do we want even. There are in authoritative PLA writings some discussions of nuclear signaling or signaling operations involving the missile forces, which I find very concerning in a crisis or a conflict. And these, when we read them, they're efforts by the PLA to reestablish deterrence or intra-conflict deterrence. But we know from other work, including great work by Fiona Cunningham and Taylor Fravel, that Chinese strategists appear to have not thought deeply about how some of these signaling effects to strengthen deterrence might actually lead to escalation. And so, for example, would China resort to a so-called demonstration nuclear strike to try to establish deterrence? Like, is that something that China envisions as falling within the no force use policy? And regardless of whether or not, I might find it reasonable for that to be covered by no force use, it's important to know whether that's something that the PLA might resort to. So I think issues of entanglement, definitions of use, and even just goals and motivations of the nuclear modernization. Why is China engaging in these activities? I think those are important issues to try to address at least early on. As far as factors that are going to get us there, I don't have great answers. I'd love to hear what Bates has to say about this. But one is I would like to see some of the track 1.5 dialogues restarted. As far as I understand it, some of the US funded ones were ended a couple of years ago, primarily because of a very understandable frustration on the US side about, one, a lack of official involvement by Chinese counterparts, and two, a sense that the conversation was continuously coming back to the same issues and there wasn't a lot of substantive progress. But I think that we're in a worse world where we don't have those kinds of dialogues to build, even at a personal level, some of the exchanges that could get us to the official level. More looking long term, and this is medium to long term, is to try to encourage the influence and development of arms control constituencies within China. And so Chinese strategists writing about arms control, I think, often view it as a competitive domain. It's an area where states like the US and Russia can kind of get one over on China and try to constrain its capabilities. And I think there may be something to be said for lack of a better word, just sort of educating China about the possibilities that are here. And maybe you can enlist, Russian counterparts to try to talk about their experience in arms control, and try to open up new possibilities about how this really doesn't have to be a zero-sum activity. There are potential areas of mutual cooperation and mutual gain to be had here going forward. So it's a very hard question, and I think this is something that people are still working on, but yeah, very, very interested to hear other thoughts as well.
John, I'm very pessimistic about the prospects for, sort of traditional arms control, arms limitation talks. I think almost impossible. And while we should, be skeptical about the higher end estimates of where China is going in terms of the number of systems, I think it's very clear, nevertheless, that there is underway a massive effort to introduce greater modernity, technological sophistication, diversity, and numbers to the systems which China can deploy in order to gain greater control in its view of both deterrence, posture towards the United States, and I think also importantly, a more sophisticated control across the conventional and even nuclear escalation ladders. That's the aim. That's not going to be possible for China to do in the context of traditional arms control or arms limitation talks. Indeed, the whole idea that China would be interested to enter into INF-like limitations is crazy. It's not going to happen. China's INF, sort of, if you want to call it, intermediate nuclear forces, if they had been a part of that treaty, that's the largest part of their arsenal. And it's the most important part of their arsenal. There's no way they're going to want to walk back those numbers. In fact, they're going to increase them. So that approach to arms control is simply not in the cards, at least not in any near to medium term, because of China's strategic interests and perceptions. I think more broadly, sort of at a larger conceptual level, I think there's a lot of debate inside China about the wisdom of even discussing and sharing views on important strategic concepts. There seems to be, in some circles, in my experience, a belief that these matters of ambiguity, uncertainty, lack of transparency are actually beneficial to China's deterrent posture, because it does raise questions for the United States. We don't know clearly where China's going. We see that as a recipe for instability. Some in China see that actually of strengthening their deterrent precisely because of the ambiguity. And one last point, I've been involved in a lot of these track 1.5 discussions over the last 20 years. And I share the frustration that the US government has in terms of they're not making the kinds of progress towards the things we want to talk about. And that's because I think the Chinese want us to talk about certain things that we don't want to talk about. So we don't get out of the Chinese what we want, and the Chinese don't get out of us what they want. They want us to say things like no first use. They want us to sort of acknowledge that we openly acknowledge that we are deterred by China's nuclear forces. We're not going to say that publicly. And so even at this high level of conceptual issues, finding common ground has proven to be extremely difficult. And then get down to the more nuts and bolts ideas of arms control through limitations. That's also off the table. So yes, it's true. There may be some ways forward that David has suggested, in terms of dialogue and still trying to find common ground on concepts. But I'm pessimistic, and I just don't see where we're going to be able to make much progress, certainly in the near to medium term.
Thanks, Bates. All right. Well, on that somewhat gloomy note, let's. But I think accurate one. Let's turn it over to our audience for some questions for Bates and David. So you can raise your hand using the function on the side, or you can and I think we did have a hand raise. So sorry, I'm gonna struggle.
There are also a couple of questions there in the chat area.
Yeah,
actually.
let's Robert, if you want to chime in with your question here.
Sure. Thanks for the presentation. I basically threw two questions out there listening to Mr. Logan and Mr. Gill. I have a personal history with the Reagan administration and nuclear wargaming, but with China, my questions have to do with China pursuing thorium reactors and SMRs. And of course, their cover story is they're doing this to diversify their energy resourcefulness. But I see this as also enabling them to diversify their weapons arsenal. The second question I raised, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when delegation of authority in '62 was given to brigade commanders and we had a risk of tactical nuclear weapons use that Moscow could not control, do we get any sense of whether China has finessed the question of always never exited a launch and the delegated release of their nuclear weapons, whether they're strategic or tactical? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to. I mean, I'm not a specialist on the question of development of thorium and its potential use in nuclear weapons. Maybe David's looked at that more, but I would just reinforce, at least from the open source, what we think we know about delegation authority, and that is, as David's already explained, that it seems to be highly centralized. There are some questions being now introduced, again, of complexity with the reorganization of the People's Liberation Army over the past 5 or 6 years, the introduction of joint theater commands, the understanding, again, from the open source, that the People's Liberation Army rocket forces conventional systems would be under the authority in wartime of those theater commanders at theater levels, but that the PLA rocket forces nuclear capabilities would remain solidly under the command and control of the Supreme Command Authority, which today would be probably Xi Jinping and maybe the two vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission. We don't know exactly, but I think that's probably a pretty good guess. So you're right to suggest that there may be some delegated authority down the road, potentially as a result of any expansion in China's nuclear armed submarine forces, but there's no open source evidence that has been the case. And so, while this topic might be something interesting to discuss with Chinese counterparts, they're not telling us much about any potential changes in this delegated authority. And so I don't really see much, I don't see where we're going to get the traction at an official level to talk about these sorts of things amongst the United States, Russia, and China. So again, I guess I remain pessimistic, but I think realistic about the possibilities for that.
I can try to talk about the first question about nuclear energy. So I also I can't speak to the thorium reactors in detail, but I think this does point to one of the limitations that I talked about in the opening, which is the fissile material stockpiles. And so just quickly, China's estimated, the best information that we have in the open source says that China probably has just under 3 tons of military grade plutonium, and that depending on estimates of how much plutonium is used per warhead, China could use that stockpile to produce another between 200 to maybe 800 additional nuclear weapons. In addition, China is developing 2 fast breeder reactors. One is scheduled to go online in 2023 and one in 2026. And those 2 reactors together, if they were used to produce plutonium for warheads, could produce roughly about enough fuel for 100 warheads per year. Now, those reactors are officially for civilian power production, and in some ways they represent the continuation of China's desire to have a closed nuclear fuel cycle and to sort of diversify its sources of nuclear fuel. But it's one of the many ways that we're seeing the loosening of some of these technical constraints that would have existed previously. So again, we haven't seen any strong indication that these are being intended for military purposes. And then, we're getting into the technical issues of how difficult it is to use certain kinds of reactor fuel for warheads. But again, this is just another way that some of those constraints are easing, and it is possibly opening up new options for China going forward.
Great. I want to kind of go back a little bit to something that you had talked about, David, which is that, we don't really know a great deal about what Xi Jinping, thinks about nuclear weapons, right? There is no Xi Jinping thought on nuclear deterrence, although there may be soon, because there seems to be Xi Jinping thought on everything in China these days. Well, what changes, and this could also be good to get Bates's view on this as well, but what changes do you hypothesize that Xi has brought to China's approach to nuclear weapons? Is this just kind of part of the broader drive to be a world-class military power by mid-century, be more active on the world stage, or are there potentially kind of newer, different ideas that Xi has regarding the use of nuclear weapons in China's strategy? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start by saying that some of the changes that we've seen predate Xi, but they're just coming to fruition now. Now he may have accelerated, or things may have been accelerated under him. But for example, the hypersonics, Chinese military scientists were writing about the potential value of hypersonics in the 1990s. The first hypersonic graded wind tunnel began construction in 2008. It was 2 years even before that hypersonics were sort of identified as a key potential military technology. And so all of this, to some extent, predates Xi. But of course, it wasn't until under Xi that we're really starting to see flight tests. Similarly, things like the DF-21, DF-26, development of those programs predated him. I do think that there's not very good evidence of Xi's particular thinking about nuclear weapons. I will say that things like the silos, which don't appear to have any work done previously, I think it's very clear that construction on those started just within the last couple of years. Even some limited Chinese strategic writing looking at American silo configuration only appears to have been done in the last couple of years. And we don't know how much even that is an indication of what was going on behind the scenes. But the silos appear to be something that, for me, marks a significant departure in so many different aspects from what China had done previously. One other comment that I'll make, though, is when we look at some of the evidence about China's security priorities under Xi, certainly we're seeing tremendous investment in the PLA, reorganizing the PLA, investing in new higher technology capabilities. But we do see, I think, some evidence that many of China's security concerns are still focused on the domestic front, and maybe even more so. And so I'll give just two pieces of evidence for that. One is, and actually both of these I believe were published by China Brief, and I promise China I didn't go into this with the intent of that. But one is, I think Brian Hart had a publication in China Brief talking about looking at the content of Politburo study sessions, and there's evidence that at least under Xi, there's been more attention paid to domestic security issues rather than foreign policy and international security issues. And the second is some new work by Joel Luthnow out of NDU, highlighting how the National Security Commission bureaucracy that's been established in the last couple of years is also more domestic focused. So that doesn't mean that she doesn't care about nuclear weapons, but maybe that suggests that there's less of an appetite or less attention at the higher levels for some of these issues. And I have, this is my last point, back when you could go and do field work in China, I did hear some speculation from some counterparts that the PLA and the rocket force in particular had perhaps gained somewhat greater space or autonomy to operate within the nuclear domain, and not so much because it had been proactively delegated it by elite leadership, but that there was maybe just less attention being paid. That's, there's very little, I don't have a citation I can give to that, but yeah, I'll stop there.
Let me just make two quick points on this, John. And first, I think we can say with some confidence that traditionally, from the very beginning of China's strategic development of China's strategic arsenal, going back to the 50s, 60s, technology has driven doctrine. So, and this just plagiarizes directly from John Lewis and Shirley Tai's work. I think that's a very valid framework for understanding China's thinking about nuclear weapons. If it's true, if that is a solid premise, then absolutely, as technology continues to advance, as China gains greater capabilities, its doctrinal thinking will also change. So, and we see, when we know that's happening. Is that because of Xi Jinping? Well, I guess it is to a degree because of all the investments that David has just noted. And as that technology advances, I think we ought to understand that that's giving Xi, I think this is the kind of person he is, gives him options to achieve the strategic interests as he sees them, which of course are bolder and grander and more consequential than any previous leader has attempted to pursue. That's point one. Secondly, again, getting back to my hobby horse here, if there's a Xi Jinping thinking about nuclear weapons, I think it might be that I want to have a much more powerful nuclear force so I can deter America at that level and then get what I need to get done at the conventional level without fear of escalation to nuclear, because we know America is deterred at that level. And for those key strategic interests close in, which of course China would define as domestic, like Taiwan, we can prevail without fear that America is going to escalate this to something much more devastating. And we can, and ultimately we can beat America at the conventional level. We cannot beat America, nor do we wish to try to beat America at the nuclear level. But if we can stay their hand at the nuclear level, we can defeat them conventionally. And I think that's what's going on.
Great, thanks, Bates. And thank you, David, as well, for mentioning those recent China Brief pieces. And I think this idea of the kind of holistic national security concept that has emerged under Xi, that kind of brings us back to Bates's point about kind of core strategic interests that are close in. The Taiwan didn't really come up in this discussion directly, but I think it's very much has to be considered here. I guess before we close out, I don't want to take any last words, Bates and David, how policymakers in Washington or Canberra or elsewhere should be thinking about these dynamics.
Well, I think we're seeing what's happening. We're seeing it unfolding, and that is to invest a lot more heavily in deterrent and warfighting capabilities at the conventional level, in ways that are going to hopefully blunt what has become quite rapid advancement in China's conventional warfighting and deterrent capabilities, because I think that's where we're really weakest, to be very honest. I know we like talking about nuclear weapons and you know, the horrible potential that they threaten to all of us. But I think where we're really falling behind, and again, to get back to my, you know, nuclear conventional dynamic, we're falling behind on the conventional level. And I think that's where we're going to see the most, or should see the most rapid changes in posture and capabilities on the part of the United States and its key allies.
Yeah, I would echo Bates's point. I'm generally look more favorably on investments in the conventional rather than the nuclear domain. I would add two other points. Is one, I think there's been relatively less attention paid to the impact on U.S. extended deterrence policy. There's been a lot of discussion about U.S. vulnerability and sort of, I think, the direct effects of that. But looking more about how are these developments being viewed in U.S. allies and partners in the region. And then the last point, and I said this a little bit in my opening comments, is I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And so I think it's important to try to get a better handle on what exactly is being done and why. And as Bates said, you know, a lot of that is just because of Chinese opacity in the domain, and most of it intentional. But I think there's a lot of good work to be done in this area, and yeah, just trying to stay on top of that. So, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, both of you, so much for devoting your time and your expertise to our discussion today. I can definitely see some future discussions on this. David just highlighted, and maybe we need a talk on the viability of extended deterrence in the current situation. So, you know, this gives a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much. All of the YouTube recording of this event will be available on jamestown.org. So you can always check it out there for reference, and also check out jamestown.org's China Brief, where both Bates and David and many other excellent experts on nuclear and hypersonic technology have written. So thank you all for taking your time today and joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Bates.
Thank you, David.